They tell you a marriage of 40 years is a foundation strong enough to hold the rest of your life. Marlena Strickland believed that once. She believed it the morning her son's wife stood in the kitchen and told her, in a voice flat as poured concrete, that she had 4 days to find somewhere else to live. She had given that family her house, her savings, her widowhood, and the slow, quiet years she had left after burying her husband. None of it counted. At 75, with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of photographs, Marlena walked out into a morning that did not belong to her anymore. The only thing she owned in the world was a piece of pine scrub her late husband had left her decades ago, and the rusted Pullman train car rotting on it. What that daughter-in-law could not have guessed, what no one watching Marlena drag her suitcase down a dirt road would have believed, is that the brass key Reuben had pressed in her hand on his deathbed 12 years earlier had been waiting all this time for the lock on that train car door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marlena had been a widow for 12 years before any of this began. Reuben Strickland had worked the rails for 41 years, starting as a brakeman at 19 and retiring as a senior locomotive engineer at 60. He was a quiet man with rough hands and a soft laugh. And he loved Marlena the way good men love their wives in small towns where nothing ever changes. They had one child, Jasper, born when Marlena was 26. They lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of Boise, paid off the mortgage by the time Jasper finished high school, and put every spare dollar into a coffee tin in the pantry that Reuben called the Someday Fund. Reuben died of pancreatic cancer at 63. It took him in 7 months. Marlena nursed him at home until the last week, when the hospice nurses moved a hospital bed into the living room because the stairs had become too much. On the second to last night, while she sat beside him holding a cup of iced chips, Reuben opened his eyes and asked her to bring him the small wooden box from the top of his dresser. She brought it. Inside was a brass key on a leather cord, dull and old, the kind of key you might find in an antique shop and not know what to do with. He pressed it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. "You keep this," he said. "When the time comes, you'll know what it's for." Not before. She thought it was the morphine talking. She put the key in her jewelry drawer and forgot about it for years. After Reuben died, Marlena had Jasper. He was 41 then, married 6 years to a woman named Priscilla Donnelly, a real estate agent with sharp eyes and a sharper laugh. Marlena had tried to love Priscilla. She had bought her flowers on her birthday, sent cards on her anniversary, kept her opinions to herself when Priscilla redecorated Jasper's childhood bedroom into what she called a meditation studio. Priscilla had tolerated her the way a hostess tolerates a long-staying house guest. Polite, watchful, always counting the days. When Jasper and Priscilla decided to upgrade to a bigger house in a nicer school district 4 years after Reuben died, Marlena did not hesitate. She sold the house she had shared with Reuben for 33 years, took the money from the sale, emptied out the Someday Fund, and handed it all to Jasper. $218,000. He cried. Priscilla hugged her stiffly and called her mom for the first time. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Marlena would live in the spare bedroom while she looked for a small apartment of her own. That was 8 years before any of what came next. Somehow, the apartment search never went anywhere. Marlena made herself useful. She cooked Jasper's favorite pot roast on Sundays. She did the laundry, weeded the front beds, folded Priscilla's blouses with the careful precision of a woman who had ironed her own husband's railroad uniforms for 4 decades. She tried to be invisible in a house that no longer felt like hers, and she mostly succeeded. Jasper would sometimes catch her sitting alone on the back patio at dusk and squeeze her shoulder and tell her this was her home for as long as she wanted it. Priscilla would smile when he said that, but the smile never reached her eyes. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, Jasper collapsed at his desk at the insurance office where he worked. A massive heart attack. He was 49. The paramedics worked on him for 32 minutes. He was gone before his co-worker hung up the phone with 911. Marlena was peeling carrots at the kitchen sink when Priscilla called from the hospital. She heard the words, but they did not arrive at her in any order she could understand. She stood at the sink with the peeler in her hand for what felt like an hour. The carrots dried out. The water ran. She had buried her husband 12 years before, and now she had buried her only son, and she was 73 years old and alone in a house that had never really been hers. The first year after Jasper's death, Priscilla and Marlena lived around each other like two ghosts who had agreed not to speak. They ate dinner at separate hours. They watched television in different rooms. Priscilla worked late and came home smelling of perfume Marlena did not recognize. Marlena cooked because cooking was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking. She made meals that nobody ate and threw them out the next day. In the second year, things began to change. Priscilla got new highlights in her hair. She bought clothes that fit tighter. She started taking weekend trips she did not explain. And then one Friday evening, she came home with a man. His name was Garrett Hollyfield, and he was 36 years old. He wore a blazer with the sleeves pushed up and a watch that was a little too big for his wrist, and he shook Marlena's hand with the kind of grip men use when they want you to know they are in charge of the room. Priscilla introduced him as a friend from her real estate network. Within a month, he was staying over 3 nights a week. Within 2 months, his electric razor was on the bathroom counter, and his protein powder was on the kitchen island. He called Marlena ma'am the way you might call a waitress ma'am, polite and dismissive in the same breath. He made comments. The kitchen tile was dated. The carpets needed to go. The neighborhood was, in his words, transitioning down. He said these things in front of Marlena, as if she were not there, as if she were a piece of upholstery that had come with the house. Priscilla would laugh at his jokes and refill his wine glass and pretend she did not notice the way her mother-in-law sat smaller and smaller in the chair across the room. The Sunday morning came in late June. Marlena was at the stove making French toast, the way Jasper had liked it as a boy, with extra cinnamon and the bread soaked overnight. Priscilla and Garrett came down the stairs together. Priscilla was wearing yoga pants and a cashmere sweater, and her face had the set look of a woman who had rehearsed something in front of a mirror. Garrett poured himself a coffee and leaned against the counter. "Marlena, sit down for a minute," Priscilla said. "We need to talk." Marlena turned off the burner and sat at the kitchen table. The same table Reuben had bought her at an estate sale in 1986, the one she had carried into this house from her old life, the one Priscilla had tried to throw out twice and given up on. "Garrett and I are getting married," Priscilla said. Marlena nodded. She had seen it coming for weeks. "Congratulations. We're doing a small ceremony in the backyard next month. After that, Garrett is moving in full-time." "That makes sense." "The thing is," Priscilla said, and Marlena felt her stomach go cold because she knew that phrase. She had heard Priscilla use it on the phone with clients she was about to disappoint. "Garrett and I are also planning to start a family. We need the spare room for a nursery. We're going to need the space." "I understand," Marlena said. She set her hands flat on the table to stop them from shaking. "I've been thinking I should find my own place anyway. Give me a few weeks and I'll—" "We were thinking the end of this week," Priscilla said. Marlena looked up. "This week. Friday. The movers are already booked." "Priscilla, that's 4 days. You've been here 8 years, Marlena. I think we've been more than fair." The word fair hung in the kitchen like a smell. Marlena watched her daughter-in-law's face and saw, for the first time, what had probably been there all along. There was no guilt in it. There was no grief. There was only a woman finishing a transaction she had decided on years ago and was finally getting around to closing. "I gave you the money for this house," Marlena said quietly. "You gave that to Jasper. Jasper is gone. I sold my home. And you've lived here rent-free for almost a decade. I think we're even." Garrett shifted his weight against the counter. "We've already arranged transport for your things. The movers will load whatever you want to keep on Friday morning and take it wherever you tell them. We're trying to make this easy." "Take it where?" Marlena said. It was not really a question. Priscilla shrugged. "That's not really my problem to solve. You have Social Security. There are senior services. You're a grown woman." Marlena sat at the table for a long moment. She did not cry. She had used up most of her crying on Jasper's funeral and on the long, quiet evenings afterward, and there was very little left in her for moments like this one. She stood up. She turned off the coffee pot. She went upstairs and started pulling her things out of the closet, folding them on the bed in the careful way Reuben had taught her on their honeymoon when they had to fit a week's clothes into one shared suitcase. The next 4 days, she moved through the house like a woman packing for a trip she did not want to take. She had 2 suitcases from her old life and 1 cardboard box she found in the garage. Into the box went the photo albums. The wedding picture from 1969. Jasper at 6, holding up a fish almost as long as his arm. Reuben in his engineer's cap on the day he retired, grinning in front of the locomotive he had run for the last 20 years of his career. She left the furniture. She left the kitchen table. She left almost everything. On Friday morning, she stood in the foyer with her 2 suitcases and her box. She had $840 in her checking account and a Social Security check of $1,400 a month and no idea where she was going. Priscilla came down the stairs in workout clothes, already dressed for whatever her morning was going to be. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Priscilla asked. Marlena thought about lying. She was too tired to lie. "No." "Well." Priscilla opened the front door. "Good luck, Marlena. I hope you find your peace." Marlena picked up her suitcases. As she walked past her daughter-in-law, she stopped on the threshold and turned. "I love my son more than anything in this world," she said. "I know you did. You were lucky to have him." Priscilla did not answer. Marlena stepped out onto the porch. Behind her, the door closed, and she heard the deadbolt slide into place with a small final sound. The sound of a chapter ending whether you were ready for it or not. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time. A neighbor across the street was watering her hydrangeas and pretended not to see her. A delivery van rolled past. The morning was warm and bright in a way that felt cruel when your life had just stopped. She had a suitcase in each hand and a box at her feet, and the sum total of her existence was now portable in a way it had never been before. The first thing she did was sit down on the bench at the bus stop on the corner and try to think. She had a small handful of friends still alive, but most of them had their own troubles. Margaret was in assisted living, fading. Doris had moved to Phoenix to be with her granddaughter. There was no spare room waiting for her in any of those lives, and she had too much pride left to call and ask. Pride was about all she had left, in fact. She held on to it. She thought about Reuben. She thought about him hard, the way you call up someone's face when you're trying to remember what their voice sounded like. And as she sat on that bench, something he had said to her years ago surfaced from the back of her mind. He had been a railroad man down to the marrow, and once on a long drive back from a family wedding in Eastern Oregon, he had pointed off the highway at a stretch of dry pine country and told her, "Marlena, I bought us a piece of land out near Juniper Bend. 6 acres. Got it cheap from the railroad when they sold off the old right-of-way parcels. There's a Pullman car sitting on it. They were going to scrap her, and I couldn't stand to watch it. So I had her towed out and dropped her on our land. Someday we'll fix her up, make her a little weekend cabin." They had never fixed her up. Reuben had gotten sick. The land had gone quiet in her memory, the property tax notices arriving once a year and being paid out of her checking account in amounts so small she barely noticed them. She had not thought about that piece of pine scrub in a decade, but it was hers. It was the only thing in the whole world that was hers. She walked 4 blocks to the Greyhound station. The ticket to Juniper Bend cost $22. The bus left at 11:15 and made the run in about 3 hours, with stops at every small town along the way. She bought a bottle of water and a pack of crackers from the vending machine and sat in the waiting room with her 2 suitcases between her knees and her box on her lap. And for the first time since Priscilla had told her to leave, she allowed herself to feel afraid. Juniper Bend was barely a town. A gas station with 2 pumps. A general store that sold bait and bread and not much else. A post office that opened 3 afternoons a week. A bar called the Switchback. The bus dropped her on the shoulder of the highway and pulled away, and she stood there in the dust with everything she owned and tried to remember the directions Reuben had described to her once, 20 years ago, on a drive she had not been paying full attention to. She walked into the general store. The woman behind the counter was somewhere in her 60s, with iron gray hair and a face that had seen weather. A name tag pinned to her flannel shirt read Wanda. "I'm looking for the old Strickland property," Marlena said. "My husband owned a piece of land out here. There's an old train car on it." Wanda looked at her for a long second. She looked at the suitcases. She did not ask any of the questions she could have asked. Out past the cattle grate on Powerline Road. About 3 miles up. "You walking?" "I am." "You sure that's where you want to go, hon?" There's nothing out there. I'm sure. Wanda nodded slowly. She rang up a half loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter and a flashlight and a gallon of water. And when Marlena handed over the money, Wanda slid $2 back across the counter and did not explain why. The walk took almost 2 hours. The dirt road was rutted and unmaintained, and she had to stop every 15 minutes to set the suitcases down and let her hands recover. Her left knee, which had been bad for years, started to ache around the first mile and was throbbing by the third. Pine trees on both sides. A red-tailed hawk on a fence post. The smell of dust and dry sage, and somebody's wood smoke from a long way off. When she came around the last bend and saw the property, she stopped walking. It was worse than she had remembered. The 6 acres were overgrown to the point of being almost impassable. Knee-high cheatgrass and clumps of bitterbrush, and a few scraggly young pines that had volunteered themselves into the middle of what used to be a clearing. A barbed wire fence on 3 sides, half collapsed. A rusted metal gate at the entrance, hanging from one hinge. And in the middle of all of it, sitting on a section of weed-grown track that ran maybe 40 feet to nowhere, was the train car. It was a heavyweight Pullman from the 1940s, dark green paint faded to the color of old moss, the lettering along the side mostly gone. The roof was streaked with rust. Some of the windows were broken. Vines had climbed up the wheels. The vestibule door at the near end was closed, padlocked with a brass lock that had gone the color of a tarnished penny. Marlena set down her suitcases in the dirt. She set down her box. She looked at the train car and at the wild, forgotten land around it, and at the long, slow slope of the afternoon shadows reaching across the clearing toward her, and she laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had run out of every other response. She laughed until her ribs hurt, and then she sat down in the dirt next to her suitcases and put her face in her hands. This was her inheritance. This was what was left. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough for the sun to drop behind the ridge and for the shadows to spill across the clearing and turn the train car the color of cold iron. When she finally stood up, her knees protested and her back was stiff, and she had to brace one hand on a fence post to get fully upright. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She picked up her suitcases. The padlock on the vestibule door was the obvious problem. She tried tugging it. She tried twisting it. It was a heavy old brass thing, corroded into place, and it was not going to come off without bolt cutters or a hammer or someone younger than 75 and stronger than her. She walked the length of the train car and found a side door that had been partially pried open at some point, the metal bent outward, the latch hanging loose. She put her shoulder against it and pushed. It groaned and gave another inch. She pushed again, and the door scraped open just wide enough for her to squeeze through sideways. The smell hit her first. Mildew and dust, and something sweeter underneath, the way old furniture polish goes sweet when it has had decades to think about it. She fumbled the flashlight out of her bag and clicked it on. The interior of the Pullman was a ruin and a marvel at the same time. Velvet seats along both sides, the upholstery cracked and split, stuffing spilling out in places. A central aisle covered in years of pine needles and rodent droppings. Brass fittings on the window frames, oxidized green. A few of the original luggage racks still bolted to the walls. Cobwebs draped from the ceiling like old curtains. At the far end, a small door that probably led to what had once been a porter's compartment. It was filthy. It was abandoned. It was hers. She found a wool blanket in one of the suitcases and shook it out. She swept the worst of the debris off 2 of the bench seats with her hand. She arranged the blanket as a makeshift mattress. She set the box of photographs on the seat opposite, where she could see Reuben's face and Jasper's face in the last of the daylight coming through the dirty windows. She ate 2 slices of bread with peanut butter for dinner. She drank half a bottle of water. She used a flashlight to find a corner outside the train car for what dignity required, and she was grateful for the dark and the privacy and the fact that there was not another human being for at least a mile in any direction. That first night, lying across 2 bench seats with the wool blanket pulled up to her chin and her coat balled under her head as a pillow, she stared at the curved ceiling of the Pullman and made herself a promise. She was not going to die out here. She was not going to give Priscilla the satisfaction of finding out, 6 months from now over a glass of wine, that the old woman had perished alone in a rusted train car. She did not yet know how she was going to survive, but she was going to. She slept badly. The temperature dropped into the 40s. Something that was probably a coyote called from a long way off, and something closer answered. She dreamed of Reuben. He was standing on the steps of a locomotive in his engineer's cap, and he was waving her toward him. And when she woke up, the sky outside the window was gray with the first edge of dawn. The first week was about survival. She walked into Juniper Bend every other day for water and food. Wanda, the woman from the general store, started keeping certain things behind the counter for her. A camp stove someone had traded in for credit, a propane canister, a foam sleeping pad that had been sitting in the back room for 2 years. Wanda would ring these things up at prices that did not match the tags and would not meet Marlena's eyes when she did it. And Marlena learned not to argue with that kind of kindness because it was the only kind she was getting. She cleaned. She swept the train car out day after day, hauling buckets of debris into the brush and burning them in a small pit she dug at the edge of the clearing. She washed the windows with rags and water, one at a time, and after 3 days, she could see out of them. She found a rusted broom in the porter's compartment that must have been there for 40 years. She hung the wool blanket across the door at night for warmth. She made small rules for herself. Get up at first light. Wash her face every morning, no matter how cold the water. Walk the perimeter of the property once a day, both for the exercise and because she needed to keep claiming it in her own mind. Eat 3 real meals, even if 2 of them were bread and the third was beans heated on the camp stove. Talk out loud to Reuben at least once a day, just to keep her voice working. On the morning of the 8th day, she was sitting on the lower step of the vestibule, drinking instant coffee out of a tin mug Wanda had given her, when an old pickup truck rattled up the dirt road and stopped at her gate. A man in his 70s climbed out. He had a white mustache and a railroad cap on his head and a way of standing that told you he had spent most of his life around heavy machinery. "Ma'am," he said. He took the cap off. "Wanda told me there was a woman living out here in old Reuben Strickland's Pullman. I had to come see for myself." "You knew Reuben?" "I worked the Union Pacific with him for 31 years. My name's Sullivan Greaves. I retired down in Boise, but I've got a cabin up the road from here." He looked past her at the train car. Lord Almighty, he really did pull her out here. He said he was going to, and I never believed him. Marlena stood up. Her hand was shaking, and she did not entirely know why. "Mr. Greaves," she said, "would you like some coffee?" Sullivan Greaves drank his coffee black, and standing up. He walked the length of the Pullman with one hand trailing along the side of it, the way a man might walk along the flank of an old horse he had once ridden. He told her things about the car she had not known. It was a 1947 model built by Pullman Standard in Chicago. It had run the Pacific Northwest routes for almost 20 years before being pulled out of service in the late 60s. Reuben had bought it for almost nothing in 1981 when the railroad was dismantling its old fleet and had paid a flatbed crew out of his own pocket to haul it out here. He loved this car, Sullivan said. Used to talk about retiring out here, fixing her up, living in her. He said the bones were good. He never told me much about it. Reuben didn't tell anybody much about anything. Sullivan smiled under his mustache. Quiet man. Stubborn. Best engineer I ever worked with. Before he left, Sullivan walked back to his truck and came back with a toolbox and a pair of bolt cutters. He looked at her, asking permission without saying anything. She nodded. He cut the padlock off the vestibule door in one quick motion, and the corroded brass dropped into the dirt with a small dead sound. Marlena stared at it. "You're going to want this door working," Sullivan said. "Front door on a Pullman is the proper way in. Side doors for the crew." He tipped his cap. "I'll come back in a few days. See if there's anything you need. Mind if I bring my wife? She'd skin me if I told her I met Reuben Strickland's widow and didn't bring her out." "I'd like that very much," Marlena said. She shook his hand. After his truck disappeared down the road, she stood for a long time looking at the vestibule door, which was now unlocked for the first time in who knew how many decades. She did not open it yet. She was not ready. She went back inside through the side door and made herself a sandwich and ate it slowly and tried to understand why her hand was still shaking. The storm came on the 11th day. She had watched the clouds building all afternoon, dark, heavy thunderheads sliding over the ridge from the west, and she had known she was in trouble because the train car's roof had at least 3 rust holes she had identified, and probably more she had not. The rain hit just after 5 in the evening. It came down in sheets. Within 10 minutes, water was beating along a seam in the ceiling above the bench where she had been sleeping, and within 15, it was a thin, steady stream falling onto the wool blanket. She moved fast. She grabbed the box of photographs first and shoved it under the opposite bench where the roof was still holding. She grabbed her suitcase. She grabbed Ruben's old wool coat that she had been using as an extra blanket. She climbed onto the bench seat and reached up toward the leak with her hand, trying to feel the source. There was a ceiling panel up there, a flat rectangle of wood paneling that had been original to the car, and her fingers found that one corner of it was loose. She pushed at it. It moved. She pushed harder. The panel slid sideways, and a piece of it came down in her hands. Water poured through the gap above. She jerked back, the panel falling to the floor. She stood on the bench in the dim light of the storm with rain falling through the ceiling, and she shone her flashlight up into the cavity that had opened. There was something tucked up there, a long flat package wrapped in oiled canvas, lashed to the structural frame of the car with twine. The canvas was old, but the package was dry. It had been protected by the panel for who knew how many decades. Her heart started beating in a way it had not beat since the morning Priscilla had told her to leave. She reached up. The package was heavier than it looked. She pulled at the twine with her fingers, and it gave, brittle from age, and the package came down into her arms. She climbed off the bench. She put the package on the floor. She pushed her wet hair back from her face. She unwrapped the canvas slowly, the way you unwrap something fragile. Inside was a leather satchel, the kind a railroad man might carry his paperwork in, dark brown and softened with age. Ruben's initials were stamped into the flap in faded gold, RWS, and tied to the buckle of the satchel, on a short piece of leather cord, was a small folded piece of paper. She opened the paper with hands that were trembling badly now. Ruben's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere. Marlena, if you are reading this, the worst has happened, and I am not there with you anymore. I am sorry. I wanted to tell you about all of this in person, but I ran out of time. The key in the wooden box on my dresser opens this satchel. Keep it safe. There is more inside than you might expect. I love you. I have always loved you. Ruben. She sat down on the floor of the train car with the rain coming through the ceiling and the satchel in her lap, and she remembered the brass key. The brass key on the leather cord that he had pressed into her palm 12 years ago, that she had put in her jewelry drawer, that she had carried with her in the velvet pouch in her suitcase, because it was one of the last things he had ever given her, and she could not bear to leave it behind. She got up. She found the pouch in her suitcase. She took out the key. She knelt down beside the satchel. There was a small brass lock on the buckle, the kind of lock she had never noticed before, because she had never had any reason to notice it. She fitted the key. She turned the lock. It opened, and Marlena Strickland broke down and wept. She wept for a long time. She wept on her knees on the wet floor of the train car, with the storm hammering the roof above her and the satchel open in her lap, and she did not try to stop it, because there was no one to see her and nothing left to be brave for. She wept for Ruben, dead 12 years, and still finding ways to take care of her. She wept for Jasper, who would never know what his father had done. She wept for the 8 years she had spent making herself small in Priscilla's house. She wept until she had emptied something out of herself that she had not known was there. Then she dried her face on her sleeve. She got up. She moved the satchel to the driver's side bench, where the roof was still holding, and she sat down with it and started going through what was inside. The first thing she pulled out was a stack of letters, maybe 20 of them, folded and tied with a piece of red string. The top one was dated 3 weeks before Ruben died. She untied the string and unfolded the top letter. It was 3 pages long, in his careful, blocky handwriting. Marlena, the doctor told me yesterday that we are out of options. I have not told you yet, because I do not want to spoil the days we have left. I want to write you some letters while I still can, so that you can have my voice with you after I am gone. I do not know how many I will manage. I will write as many as my hand allows. She put the letter down. She picked it up. She read it again. She set it carefully on the bench beside her and reached for the next one in the stack. The letters were dated from those last 7 months. Some were short, just a paragraph or two. Some ran to 4 or 5 pages. He wrote about the day they had met at the church social in 1965 and about the fishing trip they had taken to the Salmon River in 1972 when Jasper was 6. He wrote about how proud he was of the man Jasper had grown into and how he hoped Jasper would take care of her after he was gone. He wrote about ordinary things, too. The way she made coffee. The way she laughed at her own jokes before she got to the punchline. The way she had looked at 22, the first time she had walked into his life wearing a yellow sundress and ruined him for any other woman. She read 3 of the letters there in the train car with the rain still coming down. She had to stop after the 3rd one because she could not see the words anymore. She put the stack of letters back in the satchel and reached in for what else was there. There was a leather portfolio. Inside the portfolio was a deed. The deed was dated 1989, 8 years before Reuben had retired, and it described an additional 14 acres of land adjoining the original 6. He had bought it from a rancher named Cody who had been selling off pieces of an old homestead. The deed was in Marlena's name. He had put in her name from the beginning. The property tax notices for that parcel had presumably been arriving at their old house for 30-some years, and she had been paying them without ever realizing what they were for, the amounts so small they had vanished into the noise of her life. 20 acres. She owned 20 acres. There was a manila envelope, sealed with brittle tape. She opened it. Inside were railroad bearer bonds. She did not know much about bearer bonds, but she knew enough to recognize the kind of paper they were printed on and the official-looking seals along the edges. There were also several certificates of railroad stock, the old kind with elaborate engraving. She counted the bonds. There were 31 of them, in various denominations she did not understand. There was a small notebook at the bottom of the satchel. She opened it. It was an inventory in Reuben's handwriting, with a date next to each item and a brief note. June 1978, picked up 2 Northern Pacific bonds at the estate sale of Old Carmichael, paid $85 total. April 1985, traded the Buick toolbox to Hank Peterson for the Union Pacific stock certificates. On and on, year after year. He had been collecting these things for over 20 years. He had never told her. He had been a man who did not believe in banks and who had grown up watching his own father lose his savings in a small bank failure in 1953, and he had quietly squirreled away whatever he could into something he could hold in his hand. The last entry in the notebook was dated 4 months before he died. Had everything appraised in Boise by the dealer Hennessy recommended. Total estimated value, as of this date, $264,000. Some of the older Northern Pacifics are appreciating. Will hold. Marlena sat in the train car with a notebook in her lap and tried to understand what she was looking at. $264,000. Possibly more by now. Plus 20 acres of land. Plus a Pullman car that, if Sullivan was right, was a piece of railroad history that someone somewhere would pay good money to restore. She was not poor anymore. She had not been poor since the day Priscilla had told her to leave. She had only thought she was. The rain stopped sometime after midnight. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the bench seat with the satchel beside her and read every single one of the 20 letters, slowly, taking her time, letting Reuben's voice fill the train car the way it had once filled their old kitchen on Sunday mornings. When she got to the last letter, dated 2 days before he died, she found a single line at the bottom of the 3rd page that she had to read 3 times to take in. Marlena, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. Build something good with what I left you. I love you forever. Reuben. She put the letter down. She wiped her face. She got to work. The next morning, she walked into Juniper Bend with the satchel under her coat. She used the payphone outside the general store to call Sullivan Greaves at the number he had written on the back of a feed store receipt. She told him, as plainly as she could, what she had found. There was a long silence on his end of the line. Marlena, he said finally, don't tell another soul. Not Wanda. Not anybody. Stay there. I'll be at your gate in 2 hours with my wife and a friend of mine from Boise who knows about these things. Sit tight. The friend from Boise was a man named Hennessy, a coin and bond dealer in his early 70s who had known Reuben for 40 years. He drove up the dirt road in a clean black sedan and walked into the train car and spent 2 hours going through the satchel item by item with a magnifying loupe and a small ledger. Sullivan's wife, Loretta Yamasaki, sat with Marlena on the steps of the vestibule and held her hand while the appraisal happened. Loretta had been a railroad widow herself for 6 years before she met Sullivan. She did not say much. She did not need to. When Hennessy came out of the car, he sat down next to Marlena on the steps and took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. "Mrs. Strickland, your husband had a very good eye and a great deal of patience. The current value of what's in that satchel, as best I can estimate today, is $312,000. Some of the Northern Pacific bonds have appreciated a lot in the last 12 years. I can offer you $90,000 cash for a selected portion of the collection right now and broker the sale of more whenever you're ready." Marlena nodded. She did not trust her voice. She rode back to Boise with Hennessy that afternoon. She opened a new bank account. She deposited his cashier's check. She rented a safe deposit box at a different bank and put the rest of the satchel in it, including the letters, which she would not have left in a train car with a leaky roof for any amount of money. She bought a prepaid cell phone. She bought a pair of decent walking shoes. She rode the bus back to Juniper Bend that evening with $60,000 in her bank account and the rest in the safety deposit box. And she slept that night on the bench seat of the train car with a different kind of feeling in her chest than she had ever felt before. The plan came together over the next few weeks. She did not want a house. She wanted the Pullman. Reuben had wanted the Pullman, and somehow it felt important to her that what he had saved for her would be used to finish what he had started. She hired a contractor out of Bend, a quiet man named Foster who had done 2 other train car conversions on the high desert and did not blink at the project. She told him what she wanted: a small, efficient kitchen with a propane stove and a real sink, a composting toilet at the porter's end, a stand-up shower with a fold-down bench, solar panels on the roof to power lights, and a small refrigerator and a Wi-Fi router, a water tank under the car, fed from a well she would drill near the gate, hardwood flooring to replace the rotted boards, the original velvet bench seats reupholstered where they could be salvaged, new windows in the original frames, climate control with a propane heater for the winters and a small mini-split for the few hot weeks of summer. She wanted the bones of the Pullman kept exactly as they were. She wanted the brass fittings polished, not replaced. She wanted the porter's compartment turned into a small bedroom, just big enough for a real bed, the one luxury she allowed herself. Foster quoted her $38,000 and a 4-month timeline. She wrote him a deposit check and shook his hand. While the work was happening, she stayed in a small motel in Bend, and from there, she did the rest of it. She hired a well driller. She hired a man with a backhoe to clear the brush off the property and grade a real driveway. She hired a fence crew to put up new barbed wire on the 4 sides. She had a small greenhouse delivered and assembled. She bought seed potatoes and tomato starts and 100 feet of soaker hose. She had the rusted gate at the entrance taken down and replaced with a wrought iron one. Foster knew a man who could weld for her. She also took care of herself. She went to a doctor for the first time in 3 years. Her blood pressure was high but manageable. Her arthritis flared when she walked too long, but the new shoes helped. She went to a hairdresser and let the woman cut off the thin gray bob she had been wearing for years and shape her hair into a soft silver crop that suited her face. She bought clothes that fit, jeans and flannel shirts, and a good wool coat for winter, and she threw out the dowdy beige blouses she had worn in Priscilla's house because she had wanted to be invisible and they had helped her achieve it. She came back to the property in the 2nd week of October. The Pullman was finished. Foster met her at the gate and walked her through it, and she stood in the doorway of her own train car and could not speak for almost a minute. The hardwood floors gleamed. The brass fittings caught the afternoon light. The original velvet bench seats had been reupholstered in a deep forest green, so close to the original that her eyes could not tell where the old ended and the new began. The kitchen was small and perfect. The porter's compartment held a real bed with white linens. She slept in her own bed that night, in her own train car, on her own land, and she was 75 years old and home for the first time in 8 years. The transformation took on a life of its own after that. People in Juniper Bend started slowing down when they drove past her gate, and a few of them started stopping. Wanda came out one Sunday with a homemade peach pie and stood in the doorway of the Pullman with her hand over her mouth. A young woman who ran a blog about tiny homes and unusual rural living. A journalist named Pippa Quintero who lived in Bend got wind of the project from Foster and asked if she could come out and write about it. Marlena said yes. Pippa came with a camera and stayed for 3 hours and posted a feature the following week that traveled further than either of them expected. Local newspapers picked it up. A regional design magazine ran a 2-page spread. The first stranger who came to her gate was a woman named Henrietta Mosby. She was 68, recently widowed. Her husband had been a long-haul trucker who had been killed in a multi-vehicle wreck on I-84 outside La Grande, and her 2 grown children had spent the months since trying to convince her to sell the house in Pendleton and move into a senior apartment near them in Salt Lake City. She had read Pippa's blog post on a Tuesday afternoon and gotten in her car and driven 6 hours to Juniper Bend without telling anybody where she was going. She showed up at Marlena's gate on a Wednesday morning and stood there until Marlena saw her from the kitchen window and walked out. Henrietta did not have a speech prepared. She tried to explain why she had come and could not. She started crying instead, standing at the gate of a stranger's property in Eastern Oregon, a 68-year-old woman who had not cried in front of another human being since her husband's funeral. Marlena opened the gate. She brought Henrietta inside and made her tea and listened to her for 2 hours. They sat on the green velvet bench seats of the Pullman, and Henrietta told her about her husband, Roy, and about the way her children had started talking about her in the third person at family dinners, and about how she had felt herself disappearing the way Marlena had once felt herself disappearing in Priscilla's spare bedroom. "I don't know what I'm doing here," Henrietta said. "I just needed to see it. I needed to see that a woman could do this." "You can stay tonight if you want," Marlena said. "I have a guest cabin going up next month. Right now, I have a fold-out couch." Henrietta stayed 3 nights. When she drove home to Pendleton on Saturday morning, she had a different look in her face than the one she had arrived with. 2 weeks later, she called Marlena from her own kitchen to tell her she had told her children she was not selling the house. 6 weeks later, she came back to Juniper Bend for a long weekend, and this time she brought a friend from her grief group, another widow named Dolores. That was how it started. Marlena had not planned any of it. She had built the train car for herself and for Reuben's memory, and for the simple, stubborn pleasure of being a woman with her own walls again. But other women heard the story. They came. They called. They wrote her letters. By the spring, she was hosting a small Saturday afternoon gathering twice a month, with anywhere from 4 to a dozen women sitting around a fire pit in her front yard drinking tea and talking about the things widows talk about when there is finally somebody around who understands. She built this small guest cabin near the back of the property, 2 beds, and a wood stove, and a composting toilet, and she started letting women in crisis stay there for a week or 2 while they figured out what to do next. She hired Loretta, Sullivan's wife, to come out 3 days a week and help her run the place. Loretta needed the work, and Marlena needed the company. They got along the way 2 old railroad widows would. They argued about the right way to make biscuits. They watched the sun set behind the ridge together most evenings. The local women started calling the place the Pullman, the way people in small towns name things by what they are. Marlena did not particularly love the name, but she did not particularly fight it either. By the second spring on the property, she had 31 women on her rotating contact list, almost all of them widows of men who had worked in dangerous trades. Truckers, loggers, linemen, commercial fishermen. 2 women whose husbands had been smoke jumpers. A woman from Pocatello whose husband had worked the Idaho mines. They had a particular kind of grief in common. The kind that comes when a man kisses you goodbye in the morning and goes off to a job you have always known might not bring him home, and one day it does not. Marlena was not a grief counselor. She told them this. She was an old woman with a Pullman car and a fire pit and a kitchen big enough to make a lot of tea in. What she could do was be there. What she could do was tell her own story, the parts of it she was willing to tell, and let the other women find their own version of it inside what she had survived. She did not contact Priscilla. Not once. She did not write a letter. She did not make a phone call. She did not send a single message to anyone who might pass news of her along through the family grapevine. As far as Marlena was concerned, Priscilla had thrown her out of the house that had been built with Marlena's own money, and the most dignified response Marlena could offer was silence. Let the woman wonder. Let her find out, eventually, the way the rest of the world had found out through Pippa's blog and a magazine spread, and the slow word of mouth that travels through small towns and online forums, and the lives of older women who had been waiting for a story like this one without knowing they were waiting. What Marlena did not know, what she had no reason to know, was that Priscilla's life had begun to come apart almost as soon as Marlena had walked out of it. Garrett Hollyfield was not who Priscilla had thought he was. The blazer and the watch and the confident grip had been props in a long, careful performance. He had a string of women behind him in 3 states, and what he had identified in Priscilla, 6 months before he ever set foot in her kitchen, was a recently widowed real estate agent with equity in a paid-down house and the kind of loneliness that wears expensive perfume. He moved in 2 weeks after the wedding. 3 months later, he persuaded Priscilla to refinance the house and pull out $120,000 in equity to invest in what he called a development opportunity in Coeur d'Alene. The development opportunity did not exist. 6 weeks after the wire transfer cleared, Garrett Hollyfield was gone. His phone was disconnected. His car was not in the driveway. His clothes were not in the closet. Priscilla came home from a showing on a Thursday afternoon to a house that was emptier than it had been the day before her husband died. The mortgage payments became impossible almost immediately. Priscilla worked harder, took on more listings, but the housing market in her corner of Boise had softened and her commissions were thinner than they had been in years. She fell 2 months behind, then 4. The foreclosure notice arrived in a manila envelope that she stared at for 10 minutes before opening. It was during this period that Priscilla started searching the internet for Marlena. She told herself she was searching out of concern, but she was not. She was searching because she had heard, third hand, through a real estate colleague who had a sister in Bend, that her former mother-in-law had ended up with money somehow. The story did not make sense to Priscilla. Marlena had walked out of her house with 2 suitcases and a box. She had been broke. She had been 75 and homeless. The idea that she had landed somewhere with resources felt, to Priscilla, like a personal insult. She found Pippa Quintero's blog post on a Tuesday night, sitting in her kitchen with a glass of wine and an empty house. There was a photograph of Marlena standing in front of the Pullman, wearing jeans and a wool sweater, her silver hair cropped short, her hands in her pockets, her face turned toward the camera with a small private smile. Behind her, the train car gleamed in the late afternoon light. The article called it one of the most distinctive tiny home conversions in the Pacific Northwest. Priscilla read it twice. Then she read the comments. Then she went and got the half-empty bottle of wine and finished it. She drove out to Juniper Bend 3 weeks later. She did not call ahead. She did not have a phone number to call. She wore a cream silk blouse and good jeans and a rose gold watch she had bought herself in better days, because she wanted to look like a woman who was doing fine, not a woman whose marriage had collapsed and whose house was 3 weeks from auction. She pulled up to the gate at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning. There were 4 cars already parked along the dirt shoulder. The gate was open. She drove through it and parked next to a battered pickup and got out. The property had been transformed past anything she had imagined. There was a real driveway. There was a wrought iron gate. There were gardens along the south side of the train car, raised beds with tomato plants and squash, and a fence around what looked like a strawberry patch. The Pullman itself looked like something out of a magazine. Solar panels along the roof. New windows in clean black frames. The original dark green paint had been stripped and repainted in something close to the same color, but cleaner, deeper. She could hear women's voices and laughter coming from somewhere behind the train car. She walked around the side of it and found 6 women sitting in a circle around a fire pit, drinking tea and talking. One of them was Marlena. Marlena saw her before Priscilla had to say anything. She set down her tea. She got up. She walked toward Priscilla without hurrying. The other women in the circle had gone quiet. Priscilla. Marlena. Hi. Priscilla stopped. She looked at the fire pit. She looked at the women. I'm sorry. I didn't know you had company. It's a Saturday gathering. I host them every other week. Could we talk? Privately, Marlena looked at her for a long moment. She did not nod, but she did not refuse. She turned to the women in the circle and said something quiet and apologetic, and then she gestured for Priscilla to follow her around to the front of the property, where there was a smaller seating area on a flagstone patio, 2 Adirondack chairs, and a low table. She did not sit. Priscilla did not sit either. What do you want, Priscilla? The cream blouse felt wrong now. The watch felt wrong. I read about this place, about what you've built. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see that you were okay. I've been okay for almost 2 years. I know. I'm glad. Priscilla's voice cracked, and she hated that it cracked. Marlena, I made a terrible mistake. Which one are we talking about? All of it. Throwing you out. The way I did it. The 4 days. I've had time to think, and Garrett left me. He took everything. The house is in foreclosure. I have nothing. Marlena did not move. She did not blink. And so you came here. I didn't come here for money. I came to apologize. You came here for both. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. Priscilla looked at the ground. You threw me out, Priscilla. I was 75 years old. I had nowhere to go. You watched me leave with 2 suitcases and a box of photographs, and you closed the door and you locked it. You did not call to find out if I had survived. For almost 2 years, you did not call. And now you stand here in my yard and tell me Garrett left you, and you have nothing, and you want what from me? Priscilla did not answer. Go home, Priscilla. I don't have a home. That is not my problem to solve. Priscilla left without arguing. She got back in her car and drove down the dirt road and out of Juniper Bend, and Marlena watched her taillights disappear around the bend and then turned and walked back to her circle of women, who pretended they had not been listening but had been listening to every word. Marlena sat down. She picked up her tea. Loretta, sitting next to her, reached over and squeezed her hand once and then let go. You all right? Loretta said. I'm all right. You sure? I'm better than all right. I've been waiting a long time to say those words to that woman. Now they are said. The other women laughed quietly. Henrietta poured Marlena a fresh cup. The afternoon went on. She did not hear from Priscilla for almost a year. When the call finally came, it came on a Sunday evening in late February, on the prepaid cell phone Marlena now kept on the kitchen counter charging next to the bread box. The number was unfamiliar. She almost did not answer. Something made her pick up. Marlena. It's Priscilla. Please don't hang up. Marlena did not hang up. She sat down at the small built-in table by the window of the Pullman, which she had taken to calling her writing nook, and she listened. Priscilla had filed for bankruptcy. The house had been sold at auction, and she had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment near the airport. She was working 2 jobs, real estate during the week and cocktail waitressing on Friday and Saturday nights at a hotel bar near the freeway. She was not calling for money. She wanted Marlena to know that. She was calling because she had been in therapy for 6 months, and her therapist had asked her to make a list of the people she had hurt, and Marlena's name had been at the top of the list, and she had not been able to make any progress on the rest of the list until she made the call. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Priscilla said. I'm asking for the chance to tell you that I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about you. I was a coward, and I was cruel, and I have spent the last year understanding what I did to you. That is what I wanted to say. Marlena did not say anything for a moment. She looked out the window at the line of pines along the back fence, going gold in the last of the afternoon light. Thank you for calling, Priscilla. That's all you have to say? What else would you like me to say? I don't know. I don't know what I expected. I have built a life out here, Priscilla. I'm not the woman you threw out. That woman is gone. The woman you are talking to now does not need anything from you, including your apology. But I'm glad you made it. I am glad for your sake. There was a long silence on the line. Thank you, Marlena. Take care of yourself. She hung up. She sat at the table for a long time afterward, watching the pines. That evening she walked out to the fire pit alone, after Loretta had gone home, and she sat with a cup of tea and watched the stars come out over the ridge. She thought about Reuben. She thought about Jasper. She thought about Priscilla, who would have to find her own way through her own ruin. None of it was Marlena's work anymore. Her work was here. Her work was the women who came up the dirt road on Saturdays and the guest cabin that had a different woman in it almost every other week, and the small, steady community she had not planned and could no longer imagine her life without. By the following autumn, the property had grown again. She had used a portion of the remaining bond money to build 2 more small cabins along the back fence. She had hired a woman from Boise to help with bookkeeping. A regional public radio program had done a 15-minute segment on the Pullman, and after it aired, she had received over 400 letters from women across the country. She read every one of them. She answered as many as she could. On her 77th birthday, in October, the women threw her a small party in the front yard. There were 40 of them. Henrietta had driven up from Pendleton. Dolores had come. Wanda from the general store had closed early and brought a sheet cake. Sullivan and Loretta had strung lanterns along the fence. The afternoon was cold and bright, with the smell of wood smoke in the air. Marlena gave a short speech. She had not planned to, but the women asked her to, and she stood up by the fire pit with a cup of cider in her hand and looked at them. 2 years ago, I sat in this train car when it was a rusted shell with a leaking roof, and I was 75 years old and homeless, and I cried myself to sleep wondering if I would die out here. I want to tell you something I learned in that train car. The people who throw you away are telling you, in the only language they know, that they have run out of room for you. That is information about them. It is not information about you. You are not less because someone discarded you. You are not worth less because someone valued you less. The only thing being thrown away does is force you to find out what you are made of. And what most of us are made of, it turns out, is more than we knew. I did not build this place. Reuben built it. I built it. The women who come up that dirt road every Saturday build it. We build it together every time one of us refuses to disappear quietly. That is the work. That is the only work. I am 77 years old today, and I have never been more myself. I love you all. Thank you for coming. The women applauded. Loretta wiped her eyes. The lanterns swayed in the evening breeze. Marlena raised her cup of cider toward the train car, toward Reuben, wherever he was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.